There was something else in my mind that I wanted to ask. Hold that thought for just a second.
Okay.
Um, it was, oh, darn.
Were you thinking about the mortality differentials?
Oh, well, yeah, that definitely, and the healthcare and
Yeah.
the voter suppression, the mass incarceration, all of those things that have grown out of the history that you have been talking about. Would you please tell us more about that?
Well, if we're going to focus on mass incarceration, that's an outgrowth of over-incarceration of blacks, which has a long history. Mass incarceration is just an extreme version of the over-incarceration, to the point where a large proportion of the black population, particularly black men, have been exposed to imprisonment in the United States now. Uh, so if we think about it, actually, some of this dates to the Black Codes,
Mm-hmm.
which created a context for unjustly imprisoning
Mm-hmm.
blacks and then making it possible to engage in some early forms of convict leasing.
Mm-hmm.
Then the convict leasing phenomenon becomes really, really intensified in the early part of the 20th century. Um, and once convict leasing is something that is uh, is reduced in its magnitude, then we move into the process of mass incarceration, which creates further opportunities for convict leasing activities in a different way. So under the early 20th century form of convict leasing, people were put in what would essentially be viewed as prison camps. Um, and and some of those prison camps still exist today in the form of structural prisons. Uh, but but there seems to be kind of there's a continuous trajectory of the criminalization of blacks and then the use of criminalized blacks as cheap or unpaid labor.
Right. Which, of course, when I was reading about the black codes and the vagrancy and all that, it's still in practice, and
Yeah,
the police killings of blacks, it's all still tied to that. Um, I,
yeah. I
I
think at one point in the book we talk about the devaluation of black lives
mhm.
and the sustained devaluation of black lives. Um, so, uh, so I think that's very much part and parcel of the phenomena you're talking about, which would include uh, police executions of unarmed blacks.
Right.
Yeah. I
Which,
mean, one of the things that really is striking to many folks is the capacity of heavily armed whites to go into state legislative buildings with no repercussions, no resistance, uh,
yes.
no preventive measures. When it's pretty obvious that if a group of blacks had tried to do the same thing, uh, they probably would be dead.
Right. Or even when we started wearing masks for COVID-19, the
Yeah.
black men were saying, if I'm going to put on a mask and walk into a store,
Where people are, yeah, going to make all kinds of assumptions about what
yeah,
I'm up to.
it's
Yeah,
not a safe thing at all.
yeah,
Uh, let's talk too about voter suppression, because we can go back to the Jim Crow laws and the terrorization of keeping people from voting all the way up to today. So talk about that.
the history to the present with respect to voter suppression really finds its origins uh, in the American Constitution,
Hmm.
which establishes blacks as 3/5 of a person
Right.
without any rights to vote. And actually, we use that 3/5 number in two different ways. The kind of dismissive way in terms of saying that it's further evidence of the devaluation of blacks because we're only considered 3/5 of a person. But a less dismissive view is that actually the 3/5 number was a way of actually reducing some of the influence of the white Southerners because they wanted to have enslaved folks counted as a full person without any capacity to participate directly in the political process. But that's the starting point for the exclusion of blacks from the capacity to participate in American political life. That's the first phase. Is the actual legalization of slavery at the beginning of the Republic, when presumably there was a different option.
Yeah.
The Republic could have been formed without slavery being something that was treated as legal. I suspect that it could have only been formed with some of the states rather than all of the 13 states, because states like South Carolina were adamant that a reason for forming the Republic was to make sure that the British Empire did not eliminate slavery. Mm-hmm. So we may have had a different republic in terms of which colonies had actually formed it. But it is possible to have had a republic that began without slavery being a legal institution. And then at the end of the Civil War, the position that the radical Republicans took was you needed to give the newly emancipated folk, you needed to give them land, and you needed to give them the vote, and neither was done. And they were denied the vote after they did have an opportunity in what we call the 7 Mystic Years to have some significant control over Southern legislatures, but subsequently they were denied that capacity by a white terror campaign. I mean, that's all. It's the only way to describe how the black vote was eliminated throughout the Southern states.
Yeah, it was quite heartening to read, as brief a period as that was, for blacks to get elected to office, and the changes in the Southern state constitutions and public education was made available to all kids because it was part of their work in those Talk about that.
Public education in the Southern states is a creation of the Reconstruction Era legislatures that were dominated or heavily influenced by black voters. Right. The use of public resources for infrastructure development, like roads, highways, and bridges, and improvements in roads, highways, and bridges, was a consequence of Reconstruction Era legislatures. The introduction of some modest forms of social support programs was a consequence of the decisions that were taken by the Reconstruction Era legislatures. So I know you're probably quite familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction.
Yes.
But I mean, the importance of that book was it was written as a response to the lost cause advocates' narrative about Reconstruction, where they depicted Reconstruction legislatures as being highly inefficient, highly corrupt. I mean, I'm not sure how you could be more corrupt than the legislatures that preceded you, but anyway, that was the gist of the argument, that these were that the Negro rule was a rule to ruin, and Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which I think is one of the most important books that was written in the 20th century, was a response to that. And it's a book that systematically showed that for any faults and weaknesses that the Reconstruction era legislatures might have had, they were the most progressive
Yes.
legislatures that the southern states had ever had.